Bonjour, bonjour.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this controversy, changing taxation to change society. I'm Pierre. I'm a professor of economy, and we're lucky to have two very well-recognized speakers here. Through their experience and their functions will help us ask this burning question. Emmanuelle WARGON, since 2022, you've been the president of the Energy Regulation Commission. It's called la CRE, and it is important for the proper regulation of the electricity and gas markets. And you've been on the front line to protect consumers during the last energy crisis. You were Secretary of State for Ecological and Solidarity Transition, and you were Minister for Housing also. Pascal, DEMURGER, you've been the Director General of the MAIF insurance company. MAIF has been a mission-based company, and you're also intervening in the public debate as co-president of the Mouvement Impact France that federates companies, entrepreneurs, and managers of committed companies, engaged companies, for a more respectful future. So must we change taxation to change society? If taxation is a key element in the structuring of the state, the acceptance of tax paying by inhabitants is key to this. The French citizen does not feel very good about the taxation system in France, is quite upset about the rates. So it has to be more effective, more acceptable for citizens. What role can taxation play to accompany societal and ecological transitions? How can we manage taxation autonomy? So a first question for our two speakers. What is your opinion on the current state of taxation in our country? Thank you. I'm going to try to use my experience as a Secretary of State during the Grand Débat, the public consulting process, to talk about this question. Taxation is accepted under a certain number of conditions. The first is that the French citizens feel that everyone is contributing. It's the question of the way in which the contributions are distributed. Is each category contributing at the right level of equality, equity, the question of tax niches, management of taxation, taxation on French people who are the wealthiest. This is an important question in terms of acceptability. The second question is, do we know what our taxes are being used for? And on this topic, we can ask real questions. There's a paradox. We see a high level of taxation and public spending and public services that are expressing difficulty, schools, justice, health. And so the response to acceptability and the willingness to contribute is based on the quality of public service. And I'd like to conclude with this experiment of the Grand Débat National, the great public conversation. There was a book of people's complaints, and I co-animated that event with the government. And in this debate with the population, a lot of people talked about public expenses and taxation, and these two questions came back. And we had partly answered, but they'd never really been passed on after this Grand Débat. Firstly, we talked about public service. We have to maintain local public services. And so we need public services everywhere in the territory to respond to this need for access to public service. Then secondly, there was an activity premium redistribution for those who are working to answer the question to make sure that work pays off and that people who are paying their taxes get some return on this. So we have to come back to these main fundamental questions to get a real consent to paying taxes. Thank you for those first. So this is quite a vast question for France. In the last 2 days, I've listened to a lot of different speakers, and I see that on this question, company managers are really proactive and determined. But I have the feeling are being stopped by a certain immobilism on the behalf of our government, and this is not a moment for us to be immobile. We have essential needs, almost existential needs. Third point, there is an economic emergency right now, economic urgency. We're seeing a lot of industrial sectors just crumbling, and everyone has in mind the textile industry. And this is something that we could cry about in France. We no longer have a textile industry in France. 30,000 jobs have disappeared in just a couple of decades. And of course, we could give a number of examples. This is due to the aggressive nature of the United States and China, who are going to be attacking the European market even more strongly now. And this is without even addressing the question of public deficit and debt levels. It's an economic emergency that everyone recognizes, an ecological emergency that is also increasingly present. There are a certain number of things that have gone backwards. We've taken backward steps in terms of measures in France, in Europe. Let's not even get on the topic of the United States. We've seen this recently where people have stopped wanting to invest in renewable energies. They're allowing the use of pesticides that were to be banned. The Green Deal, all of these directives that had been built to accelerate the green transition, extra financial reporting, this famous CSRD directive, the duty to vigilance. And when we're challenging this duty for vigilance, it just surprises me. This directive takes on a real topic on green transition, at the same time defense of the European areas, because it would protect us from non-European companies, and this is beyond any reasoning. And Agnès Vignache published an interview in Le Monde yesterday saying, yes, in the first quarter of 2025, France had moved backwards. Our carbon emissions in the first quarter of 2025 are the same as 2024, but at the same time, China published record results on the reduction of their emissions. So ecological and social emergencies, and I agree with you, Emmanuelle, in a society where there's an implicit preference for the generation of an income from investment rather than income from work. So for the average average citizen, 2/3 have savings that were the result of their work, and only 1/3 from any inheritance. And today we're in the opposite proportion. In more than some 50 years, this means that we have not progressed, but we've actually gone backwards. We've regressed. Today, for someone who's joining the employment market, there's no longer the prospects that our parents had, the ability to change their social condition through work. Work no longer allows that. And that's obviously very serious at a societal level, with the risks that you talked about and the underlying risk, an intergenerational clash. A generation that is coming up will realize that the conditions in which it will evolve are going to be less easy than what their parents went through. Yes, you can applaud. If we look at the details now, can taxation change society? Is it a miracle instrument to change behaviors of households and companies? And I'll hand the floor back to you, Pascal. No, it's not a miracle instrument. It's just an instrument amongst others. It can be powerful if we use it properly. I started by saying that politicians are frozen today, and they shouldn't be afraid. They shouldn't be immobile. And given the three emergencies, economic, ecological, and societal, I think that fiscal policy can be a real answer, not the only answer, but it can be an effective answer to these three emergencies. If we look at them in order, dealing with the economic urgency, what happened in January 2025, the election of Donald Trump to the White House, completely tipped the way we're looking at globalization today, at international trade. The World Trade Organization rules have been blown out of the water, and we're considering now that opening without any protection is not the only answer, particularly to economic problems in Europe. So I think that taxation has to help on the economic level. It has to help protect the European continent and, of course, protect our own country. What does this mean? It means measured actions, not going into Trumpian delirium of all kinds of crazy tariffs on trade without any economic logic behind that. But we have methods, MAIF, which is the carbon tax on the borders, and this is only applied to a few raw materials that we must generalize to all finished products. What does this consist in? It consists in saying that European industries are subject to a certain number of environmental standards. That means that they must invest in the depollution of their production. When you import products that are made outside of Europe, obviously the same rules must apply. And to apply these rules, there's a compensation mechanism to ensure that we're dealing with a fair situation in the terms of the trade. We can talk about targeted customs duties on electric vehicles from China. We could talk about other mechanisms. Earlier, I talked about the extraterritorial nature of standards. Standards on ecological transition must be applied to industries that are not in Europe when they want to sell on the European market. So that meets the economic urgency. I think we need to change our mindset. We need to go from the Treaty of Rome to a New Deal and consider the question of economic sovereignty. On the ecological level, clearly, the subject of protection that I spoke about answers this question about ecological transition, but beyond that, it goes beyond taxation, but we stay in the field of public finance. Beyond that, we have to think about the conditionality of public aid.
Local authorities in Europe very high amounts are paid to the whole of the economy without any conditioning, so subsidies in an undifferentiated fashion. So the companies who perceive these subsidies do real efforts in terms of investments in for the ecological transition, or they don't do it. And it's the same thing on environmental and social clauses on public tenders without, why not, European preference. So we'll go back on instruments. So maybe Emmanuelle, you want to comment on that? I'm not talking on the same plane as Pascal. On taxation, I think we have to be very careful, very prudent as a taxation to foster change of behaviors. Taxation, fostering change of behaviors, is another way of talking about the signal price. In other words, taxation has to, let's say, orient towards such and such an action. So a big question here is not to go wrong here. We shouldn't use a negative signal, highly restrictive signal, without having solutions. And it's exactly what happened to us during the Yellow Jacket crisis, where the carbon tax was rose, and the reaction was, okay, but how can I change my car? How do I go from thermal engine or combustion engine? I don't have a lot of means to buy an electric car, which a few years ago cost a lot. Luckily, prices went down since then. So taxation can it can act in a signal price if the information is there and at the right scale. So we need industrial solutions, innovation, enterprises to develop these new this new offer, and an ecosystem to support these new solutions. It could be regulatory, it can be as a former minister of the Minister of Housing, we had created la prime rénov for the rehabilitation of housing, changed the law, and I hope it will be restabilized. So we have accompanying. Before it was a tax credit on your income tax, and so the income tax is paid only by half of the households, and this tax credit was used by half of the people who paid income tax. So roughly half of the money went to the 20% of the richest. So it was an anti-redistribution approach. Part of the state budget targeted 20% of the richer. And so we turned it into a direct subsidy with more money for those who had the least. And backed on the signal price on gas, signal price on boilers, we really need to have made the change possible. And that's, for me, is a very important learning. We mustn't give the impression to the French people that they're placed in front of contradictory injunction. You can't do that, but work it out by yourselves to do something else. We have to make sure the solutions are there, sufficiently developed, well distributed over the territory, organized, and then we can use the single price tool. Thank you. Last question before we go for the Q&A. Where should we start to change society? Do you see, can you think of practical solutions? Changing society in 3 minutes. Okay. Share. Share diagnosis, discuss, talk, listen to people, understand, start from the actual needs, start from the territories, local communities, start imposing things top down and discuss locally. Thank you, Pascal. I share that. Absolutely. There's an issue here of the maturity of our democracy, in fact. Let's take a topic we addressed that I'd like to go back on, which is pivotal, in my opinion, is how the taxation weighs on work, on labor in France. Figures were published in Antoine Fouché's book. I recommend reading this book. An average salary of 2,300 euros is taxed with all the local charges and income at a rate of 46%. The taxation for dividends, for example, 35%, I think, and retirement for 13-14%, and for inheritance, there's another figure. So there's a debate on how we want to share this load. There are solutions that exist. We know the Parliament voted the Zuckman tax on the highest revenues, over 100 million euros. And there are projects on the social VAT and other topics. But anyway, it should, contrary to what happened with the discussion on the retirement plan, it should open up a very broad debate, because it's highly structuring for society. So thank you for this transition. So we need to talk and debate. Thank you for being there. Big round of applause. Raise your hand if you have questions. Thank you. Don't hesitate. So we have a question here. Microphones, please, in the room. So first question here. And the second there. So introduce yourself, please. Quick question. Thank you. Hello. I'm an engineer in the field of energy. So I know all about these issues, but I'm surprised by the level of the measures taken in terms of taxation and legislation, the present government. And I studied the evolution of the number of millionaires in France over the last few years, and I'm really surprised that there'd be such a leap when compared to the demographic evolution. So my question is there really a political will moral intention to impose those who earn the most to ensure better distribution, or is it sort of like a closed circle, which has its hand on the power, and you know, they talk about immigration and they blur the question. So another question may eventually, we'll take a series of questions. Yes, sir, in the front. Then, yes, madam. I manage 35 employees, and I wanted to know, don't you think that the French state is delegating too many things? How can is it up to the state to, you know, I'm thinking about collecting the income tax at the source, or the payment of a mobility premium, so the rate is always changing. So why it's up to the employers to take care of public transport, for example, or to collect taxes. It should be up to the state. Otherwise, we continue and say that we have to pay for the school. It would be up to the employer to manage all of the public spendings. And two questions, maybe a quick answer. Who wants to start? Emmanuelle? Well, the first question, I think we have a question of a social pact with a view to the emergence of a small percentage of people and families who've seen their revenue explode. So Pascal was talking about the share of work and the savings or the capital, but during the same time the discrepancies, the gap grew, and so their participation for the wealthier, participation in the effort is a real question. I don't know if it's in the political debate. I think we're not specialists of this taxation debate, but I think as a social debate, something that has to be put on the table, because it's a precondition for the cohesion of society. The second question, where does the state stop? In France, we live in a paradox. The minute we have a problem, the first thing everybody does is turn to the state and say, what are you doing? Why is that not solved? Why doesn't the state do something here? So I think that if we talk about what model we want, we have a peaceful debate on how far the state should go, or the local authorities, public authorities. And it's a French reflex to go to the public authorities every time there's a problem. You know, in other countries, it's just not the case. So Pascal, yes, I fully agree with Emmanuelle on the question of social acceptance of taxation and the topic of inequalities. I remember in 1989, middle, okay, but a big strike in Peugeot and Sochaux, because the Canard Enchaîné, the newspaper, published the pay slip of Jacques Calvet, the CEO of Peugeot. We saw that Jacques Calvet was earning 15 minimum wages. Today, the average of CEOs, of heads of the major group, were closer to something like 150 or 200 times the minimum wage, and sometimes a lot more. So of course it's a very limited number of people. Financially, it's not a major issue, but socially, politically, it's a major topic. It's a major issue, and the explosion of inequalities is much smaller than the actual patrimony or wealth. With taxation of the higher incomes, the tax rate is it's 50% for the average of the French people, and we must be at something like 20 or 21% for the wealthiest, for the highest incomes, because there are some tax shelters and what have you that are which make the risk of a lack of acceptancy of taxation it increases the risk. So thank you. Unfortunately, we can't take more questions, even though there are some hands raised. And sorry, there's this lady in the back with the microphone. So don't hesitate to come to the stage if you have questions. So thank you to both speakers. No. Thank you, Emmanuelle WARGON and Pascal DEMURGER. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Have a good end of conference to all.